And now I move on, Roman numeral 4, Hispanic Americans. With Hispanic Americans, they are the largest minority group in the United States. And in fact, by some measurements, by 2050, they won't even be a minority group. They'll be the majority group. They will be the largest ethnic group in the United States. When we talk about Hispanic Americans, we're talking about people with Spanish background, which would include anyone from Central America, South America, or Mexico. People from Mexico or Mexican background are the largest Hispanic group. The correct terminology there apparently being Chicano or Chicana. But, as your book is quick to point out, what this means is that you have this large group of people who are all grumped together as Hispanic American, but they're not all homogenous. They're all very wildly different. So people who are Chicano, for example, don't necessarily want the same things that someone from, say, Colombia or someone from, say, Puerto Rico or Cuba want. And so as a result, this is part of the reason that even though they are the fastest growing minority group, their political power has not grown accordingly because they're not operating as a unit, if you will. They're not organized very well. The Hispanic growth is a relatively recent phenomenon, particularly from Mexico. While we've always had Mexican immigrants, the number of Mexican immigration, or the amount of Mexican immigration, increased exponentially in the 1980s and 90s. The reason for this is, again, why people immigrate in the first place. Remember that people generally immigrate into a country because of economic inequality, meaning that the opportunities in one country are much, much better than the country you're leaving. Just as the U.S. economy began to grow in the 80s and 90s, the Mexican economy flatlined. And so as a result, there was suddenly a big push for immigration from Mexico, Central, and South America because, again, their economies tanked at the same time that our economies grew. When you throw in the fact that Central and South America saw a lot of civil wars and things in the 70s and 80s, that also helps to explain it. So there was a huge growth of Hispanic immigration in the 1980s and 90s, and that's what we have now. Because the majority of them are coming over from areas like Mexico and the Caribbean, this is predominantly where the Hispanic groups are, in areas near Mexico and near the Caribbean. So Florida and the Gulf Coast, and then Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, these are the areas where you're going to find the most Hispanic citizens. As a result, this is also where you're going to find a lot of very tense reaction to Hispanic immigrants and so forth. This gets you to reaction. When we talk about reaction here, what we're talking about is what exactly do we do about this immigration push? Because, again, part of it is that there's a lot of legal immigration, there's also a lot of illegal immigration. There's huge numbers of illegal immigration, which we talked about back in Unit 2 for why there's illegal immigration in the first place and efforts to stop it and so forth. But politically speaking, there's a huge backlash against Hispanic immigration and so forth. One of the earliest signs of this was the English-only movements. In many states, there was a big push to include Hispanic Americans into the dialogue by publishing material in Spanish and English, by printing signs in Spanish and English, and so forth. This was the counter-push. The English-only movement were laws and so forth that would have forbade the use of bilingual education, bilingual signage, bilingual printing. California was probably the biggest one of this. I don't remember the exact name of the law. It was like Proposition 209 or something like that. These laws, again, would have banned bilingual education, bilingual printing, and so forth. And what's interesting is that it passed in California. California, you know, that bastion of liberalism and so forth, the state that always gets pointed out as, you know, the liberal Democrat area, passed it. And so this was a huge shock to everybody, that if a state as, left on the spectrum, if you will, as California, passed something like that, it was sort of a shock to everybody. But the English-only movement has picked up a lot of steam. Now you see the English-only movement in extension also by things like the talk about building the wall and so forth. A lot of that is an extension of this English-only push. It's a reaction to the increase in immigration and so forth, which brings you to modern issues. Illegal immigration is probably the big modern issue that Hispanic Americans are dealing with because there is very much a stigma. Even for those who enter the country legally, there's still very much a stigma of illegal immigration and they're taking jobs and so on and so forth. Politically, Hispanic Americans tend to go Democrat, which is why there's some talk that Texas, for example, Texas being a very conservative state, might actually end up being a Democrat state by the time 2025, 2030, simply because of the Hispanic immigration push. But Hispanics, again, in terms of demographics, Hispanics are less likely to vote than a lot of the other groups. Primarily because, again, there is a percentage of them that are illegal and therefore cannot vote, but there's also a good percentage of them that just choose not to vote. There is a cultural thing that's explained by many political scientists. They explain it culturally, saying that Hispanic Americans tend to see the family unit as more important than the cultural unit, if you will. In other words, your loyalty is to your immediate area, not to anything else. And so as a result, voting in local elections, state elections, and so forth is viewed as less important than taking care of the immediate family unit and so forth. Again, that's what some political scientists argue. Other political scientists argue that, there is no real explanation for it. It's just something that happens demographically. But in any case, this is what the Hispanic American community is sort of dealing with at the moment. Now, that takes care of Roman numeral 4, a relatively short one. We move now on to Roman numeral 5 in just a few moments.